Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly maybe a little terrifying macroeconomic question. Are we actually watching the end of the American Golden Age? I mean, for decades, U.S. dominance seemed completely unshakable, right? But when you dive into the source data, you start seeing this mounting debt and shifting supply chains that suggests a massive changing of the guard might literally already be underway.
Okay, let's dive into this, because history gives us a pretty sobering reality check here. No empire lasts forever. I mean, the Dutch, the British, even the Romans, they all eventually fell. And the thing is, collapse isn't some dramatic overnight event. It's usually a gradual, decades-long decline following some very recognizable patterns. To make sense of all these complex geopolitical and economic shifts, we've got a clear, logical roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The fall of empires. 2. China's quiet economic miracle. 3. America's debt and deindustrialization. 4. Competing global strategies. And finally, 5. Reaching the tipping point.
Let's jump into Section 1, the fall of empires. We need to start by establishing the staggering baseline of our current reigning champion.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it visualizes the incredibly disproportionate dominance the U.S. has enjoyed over the last century. Think back to the U.S. in the 1990s. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the dollar was absolutely king, and American capitalism had seemingly won it all. Despite having just 4% of the world's population, the U.S. generates 20% of global income and accounts for nearly 40% of the entire global military budget. That is the kind of power that makes a nation feel practically invincible.
But as we mentioned, history offers a clear blueprint of decline. Take the 17th century Dutch Empire, for example. It followed this exact multi-step path. It always starts with explosive economic growth, but eventually, the empire starts living way beyond its means, triggering massive debt and an over-reliance on foreign imports. It's essentially a historical medical model we can use to diagnose today's economy.
Which brings us across the Pacific to Section 2, China's quiet economic miracle.
Back in the 90s, Washington elites kind of just mistakenly assumed that by letting China into the World Trade Organization in 2000, China would simply adopt American-style democracy and capitalism. But looking at this timeline, China played a much more patient, long-term game to totally reshape the global order. Fueled by a crazy 9% annual growth rate, their manufacturing output exploded to nearly $5 trillion by 2020. Projections now show China actually overtaking the U.S. as the world's largest economy by 2028.
You know, there's an old Chinese proverb, dripping water can penetrate stone. And it's so fitting to emphasize China's slow burn strategy. Because while America was busy celebrating its post-Cold War glory, China was quietly transforming into the world's factory. Today, they produce 97% of U.S. laptops, 78% of smartphones, and 83% of all toys. Honestly, odds are the device you're using to watch us right now is a product of that quiet shift in reliance. Let's transition back to the U.S. for Section 3, America's debt and deindustrialization.
And this brilliantly illustrates the internal structural crises that were developing while consumers eagerly bought up all those cheap foreign goods. The juxtaposition here is just stark. In the 1960s, manufacturing made up 30% of U.S. employment. By 2020, that plummeted to just 8%. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturing output exploded by over 50 times in that same window. The great equalizer of the American middle class was effectively hollowed out. So how do you finance that lifestyle without a strong industrial base? Well, you lean on cheap debt. And that over-reliance ballooned U.S. national debt to a mind-boggling $36 trillion by 2024. To really understand how dangerous this is, look at the government's budget breakdown. 1 in every $6, about 16%, goes strictly toward paying interest on that debt. That's money that isn't building roads or funding schools. It is literally just servicing past borrowing.
To ground that massive, abstract $36 trillion figure for a second, it equates to roughly $150,000 of debt for every single American citizen. Let that sink in. Decades of overspending have pushed the country right to the verge of a fiscal crisis. And going back to our Dutch Empire model, this is an absolute textbook symptom of an overextended superpower.
Now you might be thinking, wait, hasn't the U.S. economy grown tremendously? It definitely has, but the gains are incredibly skewed. Consider this. Home prices have surged 500% since the 1980s. A home that was $60,000 back then is over $400,000 today. But for the bottom 30% of earners, their wages have basically totally stagnated, hovering around just $28,000 a year since the year 2000.
This brings us to Section 4, Competing Global Strategies. We're going to shift focus to show how these vastly different domestic realities dictate how each nation projects its power.
We are essentially looking at two fundamentally opposed philosophies here. The US model is entirely consumption-driven, right? Like 70% of its GDP is spent just on consuming goods. Contrast that with China's savings-driven model. Chinese citizens hold a massive $19.1 trillion in household savings, which the government then channels into huge long-term investments like high-speed rail and green energy.
And naturally, this financial dynamic totally dictates their foreign strategies. Impartially looking at the sources, the U.S. has participated in over 72 foreign conflicts since 2000, spending trillions acting as the world's police. In stark contrast, China spends its trillions on things like the Belt and Road Initiative, funding physical infrastructure like ports and railways across 150 countries to quietly grow its influence, and doing it strictly without imposing political ideology.
Let's move to Section 5, Reaching the Tipping Point, and see how this all builds up. Decades of economic hollowing out leads directly to today's reactionary political climate, where the public is demanding a return to the golden age. A clear mechanism for this is the 2024 tariff strategy pushed by Donald Trump. The goal was to heavily tax imports to force supply chains back to the U.S., while raising $1.8 trillion to tackle the debt. But it triggered an immediate retreat to avoid a bond market panic. Put simply, if investors get spooked by tariffs, they demand higher interest rates. And because that fragile U.S. bond market owes $33 trillion, a mere 1% rate hike adds $300 billion a year in interest, threatening an instant crisis.
Tying this recent economic policy back to our starting medical model, sudden retreats from the very global free trade systems a nation built are massive historical red flags. From Rome to Britain, when a reigning power's dominance slips, we see these classic reactive symptoms. An empire lashing out with short-term policies like tariffs and isolationism in a desperate bid to maintain control.
So what does this all mean? Well, it leads to this final provocative question. On one side, we have a United States heavily burdened by mounting debt and reactive, short-term politics. On the other side, we have a China deeply focused on infrastructure and a very patient long-term strategy. It leaves us with an unavoidable thought: is the era of American dominance drawing to a natural close? And are we actually watching the opening act of a new global empire? Thank you so much for exploring this data with me today, and I really hope this explainer leaves you eager to dig deeper.